That seat, the one by the fireplace, had always been mine. For 12 years, every Thanksgiving dinner I could remember, it was my corner, my shield against the chaotic warmth of my father's family. But this year, as I reached for the polished mahogany back, my stepmother, Diane, placed her hand firmly on the armrest, her nails digging into the wood. "That's for Michael, dear," she said, her voice dripping with an almost saccharine sweetness that I knew meant trouble. "It's his first real holiday home from college. The head of the table needs his space." I stopped, my hand hovering midair. Michael, my stepbrother, was already seated 2 chairs down, perfectly comfortable next to his father. The head of the table was reserved for my biological father, Ken. I looked at my dad, who was busy carving the turkey, his face flushed with the pride of a perfect host. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what was happening. "The chair by the window is lovely, Hazel," Diane continued, already pushing the matter past a point of discussion. "The light is much better for you." The chair by the window was cold, hard, and miles away from the main conversation. It was the overflow chair, the exile chair, the chair they used for the distant cousin who only showed up once every decade. I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, the one I had been taming since I was 15 and my dad remarried 6 months after my mother's death. I had learned, over 7 years, to swallow my words, to make myself small, to be the grateful, quiet addition to their perfect, blended family portrait. "Sure," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I moved to the window seat, the cold glass pressing against my back, the sound of my sneakers squeaking on the hardwood floor feeling ridiculously loud in the sudden, thick silence of the dining room. Michael caught my eye and offered a small, sympathetic shrug. He wasn't malicious, just perfectly adept at taking the path of least resistance. He was their son, the inheritor of the spotlight, and I was the ghost they tolerated. Dinner proceeded in the usual symphony of forced cheerfulness. Diane asked me how my waitressing job was going, lingering on the word waitressing, like it was a temporary, almost embarrassing phase before I finally decided to do something real with my life. Michael talked about his engineering classes and his upcoming internship, all things my father beamed about. I focused on the food, tasting nothing but the metallic tang of unspent frustration. I kept picturing the scene in my head, the dining room, filled with 20 of my dad's relatives, and me, shoved to the edge, a clear message sent without a single harsh word. It wasn't the chair, it was the pattern of tiny, almost imperceptible cuts that had bled me dry over the years. There was the time I needed a loan for my university application fee, and my dad told me, "You should learn to save," only to turn around and buy Michael a new expensive gaming computer a week later for stress relief. There was the photo on the mantelpiece taken last Christmas. Diane, Michael, and my dad smiling radiantly in matching sweaters. A beautiful tableau of their family. I was cropped out, sitting just outside the frame, an accidental shadow. My dad had later said, "Oh, the lighting was bad on your side, Hazel. Don't be so dramatic." My mother's favorite silver locket, passed down to me, suddenly disappeared, only to reappear a week later on the collar of Diane's new expensive dog. When I asked about it, Diane's reply was breezy. "I found it in the junk drawer. It makes the puppy look so chic, doesn't it?" My father had just shrugged and told me to get over it. This Thanksgiving, the chair was the final straw. It wasn't about the furniture. It was about the territory, about who belonged and who was disposable. As I sipped my water, I made a decision. A quiet, firm, cold decision that settled deep in my bones. I had spent 7 years trying to earn a seat at this table. I was done. I would get up, and when I did, I would take something infinitely more valuable than a chair with me. The pie was served. My father was mid-story about a client at work, his laugh loud and boisterous. Diane was already clearing plates, directing the cleanup crew of various aunts. I pushed my empty plate away and stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. It caught everyone's attention. "Excuse me?" I said. My voice was steady, perfectly polite. My dad paused his story, his smile faltering slightly. "Everything okay, Hazel?" "Just fine, Dad," I replied, looking directly at him. "Actually, I think I'll be going now. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone." I didn't wait for a response. I walked out of the dining room, through the kitchen, and grabbed my coat from the front hall closet. My dad's voice finally followed me, sharper now, laced with annoyance. "Hazel, don't be rude. We're about to have pie." I didn't stop. I opened the front door and stepped out into the crisp, late November air. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my dad. "Seriously? What is your problem? Get back in here and don't make a scene." I tossed my phone onto the passenger seat and started the car. I drove, not crying, not yelling, but with a singular, icy focus. I had accepted the silence for years. Now, I would use silence as my weapon. When I got home to my small apartment, I didn't unpack my leftovers. I walked straight to my desk and pulled out a box labeled Mom. Inside were old documents my mother had meticulously organized: financial statements, property records, and a thick folder of insurance policies. My mother had been a highly organized estate lawyer, and she had taught me to be the same. Over the years, my father had asked me to help him with his papers, citing my good organizational skills. I now realized he didn't want my help. He wanted me to do the tedious work he couldn't be bothered with. I had copies of every major financial decision he had made in the last 5 years. I wasn't looking for divorce papers. My parents divorced years before my mother died. I was looking for the trail of his financial negligence that he had carefully hidden from everyone, especially Diane. He was a charming, well-dressed man who loved the appearance of success. The reality was, he was an emotional gambler, constantly on the brink. I knew he had restructured a few assets after he married Diane to protect them from any future unforeseen complications. But what he hadn't planned on was my mother, years ago, insisting that a joint savings account, set up for my university education, be tied to a specific, separate property bond, a bond he had completely forgotten about, a bond that was now worth a significant amount. I found the documents. The bond was under my full legal name, established when I was a minor, with a single clause my mother had added. It could not be touched by either parent until my 25th birthday, unless a specific, named family asset, a vintage motorcycle he prized, was sold or transferred. My father was turning 60 next month. He had been planning an enormous party, a grand declaration of his success. I spent the next morning not checking my phone, which was vibrating intermittently with texts from my dad and Diane. Instead, I drove to the only person I trusted, my mother's old partner at the law firm, an elderly woman named Mrs. Albright. Mrs. Albright listened to me without interruption, occasionally tapping a polished silver pen on her mahogany desk. I laid out the bond documents and the transfer paperwork for his motorcycle, which he had tried to sell privately a year ago to cover a massive, embarrassing business loss. "You have a tight case here, Hazel," Mrs. Albright said, finally breaking the silence. "He clearly tried to access this asset, the motorcycle, which, by the very specific wording your mother insisted upon, triggers the immediate transfer and activation of the savings bond into your full control." "I don't want to ruin him," I said, looking out the window. "I just want him to realize that the person he's been pushing to the side isn't empty-handed. I want him to know that there are consequences for his behavior, and that my mother looked out for me, even from the grave." "Accountability is never ruin, dear," she said, smiling gently. "It's clarity." Mrs. Albright agreed to send a formal, perfectly legal letter to my father's attorney that afternoon. The letter would be simple: an immediate claim on the bond, and an explanation of the clause he had so conveniently overlooked. It wouldn't mention Thanksgiving. It would simply be a consequence he couldn't argue with, delivered with the cold precision of the law. The first call came exactly an hour after the letter was delivered. It wasn't my father, It was Diane. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice, usually sweet, was now frantic and high-pitched. Hazel! What is this? Your father is absolutely beside himself. This is ridiculous. That money is for the family. You need to call him and tell him this is a mistake. Now. I deleted the message. My father called 3 times in a row. I looked at the name flashing on the screen, a name that had once represented safety and unconditional love. Now it just represented a debt I was finally collecting. I finally answered the 4th call. Hazel, what the hell is this? His voice boomed, stripped of all its practiced charm. That bond. You know that was an old thing. It's family money. I need that for the business. You're going to bankrupt me over a misunderstanding. It's in my name, Dad, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Mom made sure of it. Your mother was trying to cause trouble even after she was gone. You're taking her side. No, I corrected him. I'm taking mine. You pushed me out, Dad. You spent years showing me I didn't have a seat at your table. I'm simply taking the resources I need to build my own. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end, followed by the sound of Diane whispering frantically in the background. You'll regret this, Hazel, he finally spat out, his voice shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. You'll be out on your own. I already am, I said. Happy Thanksgiving, Dad. I hung up. The calls stopped immediately. They didn't continue the argument. The silence that followed was heavy, confirming everything. He wasn't upset about me. He was upset about his control, his convenience, his money. A week later, I received a certified letter from his attorney, acknowledging the transfer. The battle was over before it began. 2 months passed. I used a portion of the funds to pay for my final year of university, something my father had always told me was a luxury I should earn myself. I was finally studying what I loved. Design. The Sunday after my final payment, my phone rang. It was Michael. I answered cautiously. Hey, Hazel, he said, his voice hesitant. I wanted to apologize. About Thanksgiving. About everything, really. You don't have to, Michael, I replied. You just lived in the house. No, I should have said something, he insisted. It was wrong. Well, he's having a rough time. He had to sell the motorcycle to cover some things. He and Diane aren't speaking much. The house is different. It's quiet. Quiet is good sometimes, I said, looking around my small, sun-drenched apartment. Yeah. Look, I'm not asking you to forgive him or anything. But I wanted you to know that I saw it. I saw what happened and you were right to walk away. His words, a simple, unsolicited acknowledgement, meant more than any formal apology. He was an observer finally brave enough to speak the truth. Thank you, Michael, I said. That means a lot. So, no crazy holiday plans this year, right? He asked, a small, genuine laugh in his voice. Just making my own, I replied. A table for 1, maybe 2, in a place where I actually belong. I hung up, a sense of lightness washing over me. I hadn't destroyed his life. I had just exposed the shaky foundation he had built. He was living the consequences of his own choices. I didn't need his seat at the table. I needed my own 2 feet. And that holiday, I learned that my mother had made sure I had them, steady and financially secure, waiting for the day I was finally ready to stand up. I walked away from their perfect posed family photo, but I walked straight toward my own, unedited, true future. And that was the greatest gift I could ever give myself. The bond money didn't change my life overnight, but it changed something far more important: my direction. 2 months after Thanksgiving, winter settled over the city like a heavy quilt. I spent most evenings in my tiny apartment, surrounded by design sketches taped to the walls, pencils tucked behind my ear, and a cup of cheap coffee going cold beside me. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't loud, but it was mine. For the first time in years, the silence around me wasn't punishment. It was peace. My father didn't call again. Not for Christmas, not for New Year's, not for my birthday. For a while, that hurt, a deep, hollow ache I tried not to look directly at. A part of me still hoped he'd show up at my door and say the words I had waited 7 years to hear. I'm sorry. You mattered. I should have protected you. But some people don't offer apologies. Some people only offer lessons. One early February morning, as I walked back from class, snow crunching under my boots, I noticed a figure sitting on the steps outside my building. Michael. Hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, breath fogging the cold air. He stood when he saw me. Dad's been different, he said quietly. Distant, angry, at everyone. But I don't think he's angry at you anymore. I said nothing. He's angry at himself, Michael continued. But he doesn't know how to say it. And Diane, she's just pretending none of it happened. We talked for an hour on those cold concrete steps. Not as step-siblings, not as rivals in an invisible family hierarchy, but as two kids who grew up under the weight of someone else's expectations. For the first time, I realized Michael wasn't the golden boy. I'd just been the ghost too long to see that he was lonely too. Before leaving, he handed me a small box. Dad asked me to give you this, he said. Inside was my mother's locket. Cleaned, polished, restored. I thought Diane kept it, I whispered. She did, he said. Dad took it back. It wasn't an apology. But it was a crack in the armor he'd built, one he'd never admit existed. That night, I placed the locket on my desk, next to my sketches, a symbol of who I was and who I refused to become. Spring arrived slowly. My portfolio grew thicker, my confidence steadier. I applied for a design fellowship, a competitive one I never would have dared try for before. When the acceptance email came, I stared at it for a full minute before I finally let myself believe it. Hazel Brooks, selected candidate. I almost laughed. The girl in the window seat, the afterthought at the holiday table, was finally stepping into the center of her own story. A week before the new semester, Michael called again. "Are you coming home for Easter?" he asked. "Home?" I repeated gently. "I don't think I live there anymore." He chuckled softly. "I figured you'd say that, but if you ever want to grab dinner, as siblings, not as hostages of the same house, my offer stands." And I realized then, some relationships survive the wreckage, some grow from it. On the first warm day of April, I sat at my small dining table, sunlight pouring through the curtains, my mother's locket resting against my collarbone, and I made myself a promise. I would never fight for a seat at anyone else's table again. I would build my own, a table where I wasn't an afterthought, where I wasn't cropped out of the picture, where the light was warm and the chair was comfortable, because I chose it. And one day, when someone asked me where I came from, I wouldn't say, "a family that forgot me." I'd say, "I came from a woman who planned for my future. I came from a girl who learned to stand alone, and I became someone who doesn't sit quietly in the cold." That Thanksgiving had taken away a chair, but it had given me something greater. My place, my voice, my future. And I wasn't giving any of it back.